The Lost Road. The opening chapters. For the text of The Lost Road and its relation to the fall of Numenor, see pages 8 to 10. I give here the 2 completed chapters at the beginning of the work and following them with a brief commentary. Chapter 1. A Step Forward. Young Alboin. Alboin, Alboin. There was no answer. There was no one in the playroom. Alboin, also an arrow, stood at the door and called into the small high garden at the back of his house. At length, a young voice answered, sounding distant and like the answer of someone asleep or just awakened. Yes? Where are you? Here? Where is here? Here, up on the wall, father. Oswin sprang down the steps from the door into the garden and walked along the flower-bordered path. He led after a turn to a low stone wall, screened from the house by a hedge. Beyond the stone wall there was a brief space of turf and then a cliff edge beyond which outstretched, and now shimmering in a calm evening, the western sea. Upon the wall Oswin found his son, a boy about 12 years old, lying gazing out to sea with his chin in his hands. So there you are, he said. You take a deal of calling, didn't you hear me? Not before the time when I answered, said Alboin. Well, you must be deaf or dreaming, said his father. Dreaming, it looks like. It is getting very near bedtime, so if you want any story tonight, we shall have to begin at once. I'm sorry, father, but I was thinking. What about? Oh, lots of things mixed up. The sea, and the world, and Alboin. Alboin? Yes, I wondered why Alboin. Why am I called Alboin? They often ask me why Alboin at school and they call me Allbone. But I'm not, am I? You look rather bony, boy, but you are not all bone, I am glad to say. I am afraid I called you Alboin, and that is why you are called it. I am sorry, I never meant it to be a nuisance to you. But it is a real name, isn't it? Said Alboin eagerly. I mean, it means something, and men have been called it. It isn't just invented. Of course not. It is just as real and just as good as Oswin, and it belongs to the same family, you might say. But no one ever bothered me about Oswin, though I often used to get called Oswald by mistake. I remember how it used to annoy me, though I can't think why. I was rather particular about my name. They remained talking on the wall overlooking the sea, and did not go back into the garden or the house until bedtime. Their talk, as often happened, drifted into storytelling, and Oswin told his son the tale of Alboin, son of Aldoin, the Lombard king, and of the great battle of the Lombards and the Gepids, remembered as terrible even in the grim 6th century, and of the kings Thursin and Cummin, and of Rosamunda. Not a good story for near bedtime, he said, ending suddenly with Alboin's drinking from the jeweled skull of Cummin. I don't like that Alboin much, said the boy. I like the Gepids better and King Thursin. I wish they had won. Why didn't you call me Thursin or Thursmond? Well, really Mother had meant to call you Rosamund, only you turned up a boy. And she didn't live to help me choose another name, you know, so I took one out of that story. Because it seemed to fit. I mean, the name doesn't belong only to that story. It is much older. Would you rather have been called Elfriend? For that's what the name means. No, said Alboin doubtfully. I like names to mean something, but not to say something. Well, I might have called you Elfwine, of course. That is the old English form of it. I might have called you that. Not only after Elfwine of Italy, but after all the Elfriends of old. After Elfwine, King Alfred's grandson, who fell in the great victory in 937, and Elfwine, who fell in the famous defeat at Maldon, and many other Englishmen and Northerners in the long line of elf friends. But I gave you a Latinized form. I think that is best. The old days of the North are gone beyond recall, except in so far as they have been worked into the shape of things as we know it into Christendom. So I took Alboin, for it is not Latin and not Northern, and that is the way of most names in the West, and also of the men that bear them. I might have chosen Albinus, for that is what they sometimes turned the name into, and it wouldn't have reminded your friends of bones. But it is too Latin, and means something in Latin. And you are not white or fair, boy, but dark. So Alboin you are, and that is all there is to it, except bed. And they went in. But Alboin looked out of his window before getting into bed, and he could see the sea beyond the edge of the cliff. It was a late sunset, for it was summer. The sun sank slowly to the sea, and dipped red beyond the horizon. The light and color faded quickly from the water. A chilly wind came up out of the west, and over the sunset rim great dark clouds sailed up, stretching huge wings southward and northward, threatening the land. They looked like the eagles of the Lord of the West coming upon Numenor, Alboin said aloud, and he wondered why, though it did not seem very strange to him. In those days he often made up names. Looking on a familiar hill, he would see it suddenly standing in some other time in story. The green shoulders of Ammon Arab, he would say. Waves are loud upon the shores of Beleriand, he said one day, when Storm was paddling water at the foot of the cliff below the house. Some of these names were really made up, to please himself with their sound, or so he thought, but others seemed real, as if they had not been spoken first by him. So it was with Numenor. I like that, he said to himself. I could think of a long story about the land of Numenor. But as he lay in bed, he found that the story would not be thought. And soon he forgot the name, and other thoughts crowded in, partly due to his father's words, and partly to his own daydreams before. Dark Alboin, he thought. I wonder if there's any Latin in me. Not much, I think. I love the western shores, and the real sea. It is quite different from the Mediterranean, even in stories. I wish there was no other side to it. There were dark-haired people who were not Latins. Are the Portuguese Latins? What is Latin? I wonder what kind of people live in Portugal and Spain and Ireland and Britain in old days. Very old days, before the Romans or the Carthaginians. Before anybody else. I wonder what the man thought who was the first to see the Western Sea. Then he fell asleep and dreamed. But when he woke, the dream slipped beyond recall and left no tale or picture behind, only the feeling that these had brought. The sort of feeling Alboin connected with long strange names. And he got up, and summer slipped by, and he went to school and went on learning Latin. And he learned Greek. And later, when he was about 15, he began to learn other languages, especially those of the north: Old English, Norse, Welsh, Irish. This was not much encouraged, even by his father, who was a historian. Latin and Greek, it seemed to be thought, were enough for anybody, and quite old-fashioned enough, when there were so many successful modern languages spoken by millions of people, not to mention maths and all the sciences. But Alboin liked the flavor of the older northern languages quite as much as he liked some of the things written in them. He got to know a bit about linguistic history, of course. He found that you rather had it thrust on you anyways, by the grammar writers of unclassical languages. Not that he objected. Sound changes were a hobby of his at the age when other boys were learning about the insides of motor cars. But although he had some idea of what were supposed to be the relationships of European languages, it did not seem to him quite all the story. The languages he liked had a definite flavor, and to some extent a similar flavor, which they shared. It seemed, too, in some way related to the atmosphere of the legends and myths told in the languages. One day, when Alboin was nearly 18, he was sitting in the study with his father. It was autumn and the end of summer holidays spent mostly in the open. Buyers were coming back. It was the time in all the year when book lore is most attractive to those who really like it at all. They were talking language, for Errol encouraged his boy to talk about anything he was interested in, although secretly he had been wondering for some time whether northern languages and legends were not taking up more time and energy than their practical value in a hard world justified. But I had better know what is going on as far as any father can, he thought. He'll go on anyway if he really has a bent, and it had better not be bent inwards. Alboin was trying to explain his feeling about language atmosphere. You get echoes coming through, you know, he said. And odd words here and there, often very common words in your own language, but quite unexplained by the etymologists, and in the general shape and sound of all the words somehow, as if something was peeping through from deep under the surface. Of course, I am not a philologist, said his father, but I never could see that there was much evidence in favor of ascribing language changes to a substratum. Though I suppose underlying ingredients do have an influence, though it is not easy to define, or the final mixture in the case of peoples taken as a whole, different national talents and temperaments, and that sort of thing. But races and cultures are different from languages. Yes, said Alboin, but very mixed up, all three together, and, after all, language goes back by a continuous tradition into the past just as much as the other two. I often think that if you knew the living faces of any man's ancestors a long way back, you might find some queer things. You might find that he got his nose quite clearly from, say, his mother's great-grandfather, and yet that's something about his nose, its expression or its set, or whatever you like to call it, really came down from much further back from, say, his father's great-great-great-grandfather or greater. Anyway, I like to go back, and not with race only, or culture only, or language, but with all three. I wish I could go back with the three that are mixed in us, father. Just a plain arrows with a little house in Cornwall in the summer. I wonder what one would see. It depends how far you went back, said the elder Errol. If you went back beyond the ice ages, I imagine you would find nothing in these parts, or at any rate a pretty beastly and uncomely race, and a tooth and nail culture, and a disgusting language with no echoes for you, unless those are food noises. Would you? Said Alboin. I wonder. Anyway, you can't go back, said his father, except within the limits prescribed to us mortals. You can go back in a sense by honest study, long and patient work. You had better go in for archaeology as well as philology. They ought to go well enough together, though they aren't joined very often. Good idea, said Alboin. But you remember, long ago, you said I was not all bone. Well, I want some mythology as well. I want myths, not only bones and stones. Well, you can have them. Take the whole lot on, said his father, laughing. But in the meanwhile, you have a smaller job on hand. Your Latin needs improving, or so I am told, for school purposes, and scholarships are useful in lots of ways, especially for folk like you and me who go in for antiquated subjects. Your first shot is this winter, remember. I wish Latin prose was not so important, said Alboin. I am really much better at verses. Don't go putting any bits of your Arisan, or Elf Latin, or whatever you call it, into your verses at Oxford. It might scan, but it wouldn't pass. Of course not, said the boy, blushing. The matter was too private, even for private jokes. And don't go blabbing about Arisan outside the partnership, he begged, or I shall wish I had kept it quiet. Well, you did pretty well. I don't suppose I should ever have heard about it if you hadn't left your notebooks in my study. Even so, I don't know much about it. But, my dear lad, I shouldn't dream of blabbing. Even if I did, only don't waste too much time on it. I am afraid I am anxious about that scholarship, not only from the highest motives. Cash is not too abundant. Oh, I haven't done anything of that sort for a long while, at least hardly anything, said Alboin. It isn't getting on too well, then? Not lately. Too much else to do, I suppose. But I got a lot of jolly new words a few days ago. I'm sure Lome Linde means nightingale, for instance, and certainly Lome is night, though not darkness. The verb is very sketchy still, but he hesitated. Reticence and uneasy conscience were at war with his habit of what he called partnership with the pit, and his desire to unbosom the secret anyway. But the real difficulty is that another language is coming through as well. It seems to be related, but quite different, much more northern. Alda is a tree, a word I got a long time ago, in a new language that is Galad and Orn. The sun and moon seem to have similar names in both Anar and Isil, beside Anor and Ithil. I like the first one, then the other, in different moods. Beleriandic is really very attractive, but it complicates things. Good Lord, said his father, this is serious. I will respect unsolicited secrets. But do you have a conscience as well as a heart and moods? Or get a Latin and Greek mood? I do. I've had one for a week, and I've got it now. A Latin one luckily, and Virgil in particular. So here we part. He got up. I'm going to do a bit of reading. I'll look in when I think you ought to go to bed. He closed the door on his father's snort. As a matter of fact, Errol did not really like the parting shot. The affection in it warmed and saddened him. A late marriage had left him now on the brink of retirement from his schoolmaster's small pay to a smaller pension just when Alboin was coming of university age. And he had begun to feel, and this year to admit in his heart, a tired man. He had never been a strong man. He would have liked to accompany Alboin a great deal further on the road, as a younger father probably would have done, but he did not somehow think he would be going very far. Damn it, he said to himself. A boy of that age ought not to be thinking such things, worrying whether his father is getting enough rest. Where's my book? Alboin, in the old playroom, turned into Junior's study, looked out into the dark. He did not for a long time turn to books. I wish life was not so short, he thought. Languages take such a time, and so do all the things one wants to know about. And the powder, he is looking tired. I want him for years. If he lived to be 100, I should be only about as old as he is now, and I should still want him. But he won't. I wish we could stop getting old. The powder could go on working and write that book he used to talk about Cornwall, and we could go on talking. He always plays up, even if he does not agree or understand. Bother Herr Sam. I wish he hadn't mentioned it. I'm sure I shall dream tonight. It is so exciting. The Latin mood will go. He is very decent about it, even though he thinks I am making it all up. If I were, I would stop it, to please him. But it comes, and I simply can't let it slip when it does. Now there is Beleriandic. Away west the moon rode in ragged clouds. The sea glimmered palely out of the gloom, wide, flat, going on to the edge of the world. Confound you, dreams, said Alboin. Lay off, and let me do a little patient work, at least until December. A scholarship would brace the powder. He found his father asleep in his chair at 10:30. They went up to bed together. Alboin got into bed and slept with no shadow of a dream. The Latin mood was in full blast after breakfast, and the weather allied itself with virtue and sent torrential rain.